I have to begin with a great big thank you, a gift to me and my family from this church following my 500th sermon was 2 weeks this last month at the Isle of Palms on the beach near Charleston. And I was there with my wife and our three daughters and our sons-in-law and our five grandchildren. And I got to tell you, it was one of those kind of fairy tales of family togetherness where we had sand in our swimsuits like 24/7 and salty air and sunscreen and all the rest. And my favorite part was getting inside the crazy little heads of my grandchildren. And where I am Papa, I'm known as Papa. And at one point, my grandson James, 4 years old, was talking to my daughter, and he was looking out across the ocean. And he could see a platform out there way in the distance with lights, and he was waxing philosophical. He said, if I was out there in a boat and I dropped a toy, it would go down to the bottom of the ocean, and I couldn't get it. It would be gone. And the only way you could get that toy would be somebody had to put on mask and snorkel and fins, and nobody would do that. My toy would be gone. And then he said, wait a minute, Papa would get my toy. Kind of be a little hero to my grandson. But then I remembered that my grandfather's greatest contribution to my life is that he made sure that Jesus was my hero. I was never with my grandfather that he did not point me to Jesus. You and I are hardwired for hero worship. Hasn't every one of us met someone at some point in our life where we said, I will never wash this hand again? And it seems like every era has its own heroes. I'm reading a book by Bill Bryson about America in the summer of 1927. And back then, the great hero of America was Charles Lindbergh. Young man went from nowhere to an instant world fame by crossing the Atlantic nonstop, solo, in an airplane, a single engine, a single-seater airplane. He's the first person ever to be in New York one day and Paris the next. And one newspaper said it was the greatest event since the resurrection. And people worshiped the ground that Charles Lindbergh walked on. People would get wind of the possibility that he might be flying into a certain airport, and 30,000 people might show up just to get a glimpse of Charles Lindbergh. At one point, the state of Minnesota actually thought about changing its name to Lindberghia. He would write a check. Nobody ever would cash a check that he wrote. They'd only frame it. And when he was out to dinner, in the back, they'd fight over the chicken bones from his plate. Our heroes make us do strange things. Robert Redford was once spotted on the street of Santa Fe by a woman, and according to bystanders, she just stood there unconsciously and snapped open her purse and dropped her ice cream cone inside and snapped it shut. Jesus did that kind of thing to people. Once at a dinner party, a lady saw Jesus, and she ran and got a vial of perfume that was worth more than her whole house, her whole life savings. And she came and she broke the neck and she poured out the contents on Jesus' feet, then got down on her knees and wiped his feet with the tresses of her hair. Today, we're talking about the most influential and greatest human ever to walk this planet. It's easy to get an idea that the New Testament is just a bundle of just haphazard incidents that have been strung together. But the exact opposite is true. Today, we're going to look at the climax of Mark's gospel that happens exactly in the middle of Mark's gospel. Mark's gospel has 16 chapters, and we're going to be looking at the very end of chapter 8. And everything before in Mark's gospel leads up to this moment, and everything that follows just flows from this moment. In the middle of the gospel, where Jesus has a conversation with Peter, in which Jesus sets the stage for what will later be known to the world as the Christian religion. I'd like for you to look at this very important, short snatch of conversation in Mark's gospel. We're looking at verses 27 through 30. Here's what we read. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Here ends the reading. Here are 12 men and their leader. And these 12 men over the past few months have been witnesses at a string of miracles, the likes of which the world had never seen. I mean, here is a young carpenter who turns funerals into parties, who can take a boy sack lunch and feed 5,000 people, who quotes Old Testament passages about God as references about himself and implies that someday on the day of judgment, he's going to be one who's passing out justice. And they see the sparkle in this man's eye as he holds great crowds in the palm of his hand as he spins out his parables. And the question obviously on everyone's lips is, who is he? And the buzz over back fences and on street corners of Palestine is, who is this Jesus? And of course, the rumors are flying. Now, the drama in this scene is the fact that Jesus himself is asking that very question of his own disciples. He says, who do you say that I am? Now, Jesus need to know his days on earth are numbered, and he is now having his earthly ministry draw to a close. He wants to know, is there going to be anybody to carry on the movement? Do even his closest followers get who he is? And then adding to the drama of this scene is the fact of the location where it takes place, Caesarea. Caesarea literally means Caesar's town. There are literally something like 14 pagan temples in this area where Jesus asked this question. And so there in the shadow of these pagan monuments to the godhood of Caesar, here stands a penniless king who doesn't have a pillow for his head. And this brash young man asks his disciples to believe that he is God. Who do people say I am, he queries. What's out there in the blogosphere? What's in the Twittersphere? What are the papers saying about me? Who do people say I am? And they reply, Lord, some say John the Baptist come back to life, and others say Elijah, and others say one of the prophets. But one thing for certain, Lord, you are among our greatest heroes. Well, okay, let's start there. Jesus as hero. Is he your hero this morning? He's certainly my hero. And when you think about it, sometimes we rush so quickly to saying Jesus is God, we sort of lose the fact that there was this raw animal magnetism about this man, Jesus of Nazareth. And if you want to see that magnetism, all you need to do is watch the movie Ben-Hur, my all-time favorite biblical movie. I think I lost track after the 10th time I saw it. And the genius of Ben-Hur is the fact they never show Jesus' face, but they always show the impact that Jesus has on the faces of people around him. And one of my favorite scenes is one in which Judah Ben-Hur, if you know the story, is a rebel Hebrew prince, and he's captured by the Romans. And he, along with a group of other prisoners, are being transported from Jerusalem to Rome. First leg of the journey is a camel caravan where Judah Ben-Hur, along with the others, are staggering along behind some camels across a scorching desert. As they go along under the sun, their lips are broken and bleeding, and their tongues are swollen. And finally, they arrive at a small little village. And the Roman officer in charge turns and he says, "Water for my men and their horses, and the prisoners in that order." And then turning to Judah Ben-Hur, the officer says, "And no water for him." Cut. Now there's a camera angle is at the back of a muscular back of a carpenter who's working at his bench. The carpenter hears the ruckus outside. He drops his hammer. He goes, looks out the window, and he sees Judah Ben-Hur sprawled in the sand. Still watching from the back, you see the carpenter go outside. He goes to a well, and he takes a gourd, and he scoops out cold water from the well. Then cut, close up of the calloused hands of the carpenter holding the gourd, hands it to Ben-Hur. Ben-Hur, now even tighter shot on Ben-Hur's face as he takes that gourd, and he starts to guzzle that water down, and he tips his head back. And as he's lifting his head back, he finds himself looking full into the face of that carpenter. And something he sees in the face of the carpenter makes him stop drinking the water. And you wonder what face could make a man dying of thirst stop thinking about water. And all of a sudden, the Roman officer realizes that his orders are being disobeyed, and he turns with a whip, and he charges these two men. The carpenter just stands up and looks at the Roman officer, who freezes in his tracks. And then, mumbling incoherently, the Roman officer turns and walks away. what face could make a Roman officer back down in full view of his men? We could all read Ben-Hur's mind as he's walking away thinking, who is that man? Who is that man? And today people still wonder. 2,000 years has not quenched our curiosity about this enigmatic figure. If you Google Jesus, as I did this last week, you get 706 million hits. And there is no figure in history who reaches down through the centuries to command our loyalty like Jesus does today, where 2.2 billion people on this planet call him Lord. And so the most natural question is, who is this man? How do you explain the spell that Jesus casts over people? I read a book by an eminent British historian this summer by the name of Paul Johnson. It's called Jesus, a Biography from a Believer, in which he says that more than any human ever lived, Jesus made human beings feel treasured. People would listen to Jesus and they would literally believe that God knew the number of hairs they had on their head. And he did it in little ways. I never thought about the way Paul Johnson says it, but he said Jesus had dazzling people skills. He had a way of establishing instant rapport with people. You'd meet Jesus and he might give you a nickname. He might say, Simon? Oh, no, your name is Petros. Hey, Rocky, you're my man. Or James and John he called sons of thunder. But all this was just Jesus' way of always doing everything that was possible at that very moment to get himself as close as he could to people. And of course, women swooned around Jesus. He talked to them, he laughed with them, he bantered with them at a time when men would not do that with women. I love what Johnson says. You know how we got the Gospels is that Jesus never forgot a conversation he had with anybody, and he told his disciples, and they wrote it down. And he gave us what he calls the Gospels, those little stories, he calls them the human core of the New Testament, and he says there's nothing like it in the literature of the world. And yet that same Jesus was capable, when he saw injustice, of flying it into such a rage that he once twisted leather into a whip, and he snapped it over the head of those rascals and drove them right out of the building. And yet that very same Jesus was so tender that while he was speaking, there would be gathers of little children over to the side, knowing that as soon as Jesus was finished talking to their parents, that Jesus would come over and get down and play with them. Isn't Jesus your hero? Don't you just love Jesus? And so we say, Jesus, you're more than John the Baptist. You're more than Elijah. You're more than a prophet. You're the greatest human who ever walked this earth. But that's not enough. And Jesus asks his disciples, but who do you say that I am? And Peter, like an eager student who wants to show off how much he knows, steps forward and he says, you are the Messiah. More than a teacher, more than a prophet, more than a hero. You are the long-awaited Messiah of Israel. You know, a lot of preachers stop right there and they say, aha, there it is. There's the answer that Jesus wanted. You are the Messiah. But look what he says here. If you read it for yourself, I think Jesus gives that answer an icy reception too. Listen what it says in verse 30. It says, Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Why? Because Messiah was not enough. See, the Messiah, people had a picture of who the Messiah would be. And the Messiah would be a father like Abraham, a deliverer like Moses, a king like David, brains of Solomon, the biceps of Samson, all wrapped up in one great human being who would come and wipe out the Romans. But you know, the Messiah would never be on a par with God the Father Almighty. The Messiah was a mighty but very human king. And so Messiah was not enough. And so you got to feel for these poor disciples. Because Jesus keeps asking them, they keep answering, and it always comes up short. Because they don't have the words in their vocabulary to express Jesus any more than they could capture the Milky Way in a thimble or hold the Atlantic Ocean in a Dixie cup. And I don't think Jesus is toying with his disciples. What he's doing here is teaching them something that we need to know as well, and that is that Jesus just rips the seams out of any category we try to place him in. As someone once said, Jesus is simply the beyond in our midst. The Apostle Paul tried to express Jesus with words, and finally, what does Paul do? He throws up his hands. Jesus is the name above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. This morning, I want to give you just 3 reasons why I think Jesus should be your hero. I hope you'll take these seriously. The first reason I think Jesus should be your hero, and even beyond a hero, obviously, is that Jesus alone can fulfill the longings of your heart. Think for a moment. Fairy tales are filled with heroes. And fairy tales are expressions of human longing. Beauty and the Beast, Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, and Peter Pan are not based on actual real-life events. I hate to tell you that, but that's absolutely true. They are all about simply human longing. And it turns out that you and I have unmet needs that everyday life cannot satisfy. We have a hopeless craving for the supernatural that's down deep in our souls. Let me give you a little example of that. You ever wake up in the middle of the night out of a dream where you're flying? I do. I wake up flying over mountains. I don't know about you, but I do. There's something inside of us that makes us feel like we were meant to fly. You and I also have a dream. What is it? The dream that we'll live forever with our loved ones, don't we? That we'll live happily ever after an eternity. We have dreams of talking to the animals, of slaying dragons. We have a dream that will rid this world of everything that could hurt or terrify a child. And you know, in the great fairy tales, there's this impossible magic that makes those dreams come true. And I think some of us, when we tell those fairy tales to our kids, we have a place down deep in our soul beyond words where we know that our world is somehow under the spell of an evil curse. And we want that hero to come and deliver us from that evil curse, to help us live happily ever after, to make our longings come true. You know, it's interesting, the most popular movie right now, Guardians of the Galaxy. And it's about these intergalactic outlaws who are trying to put the Earth under interstellar domination. I mean, you see the parallels with the gospel? I mean, the idea that the human race is under the spell of an evil sorcerer, and there is this savior who comes from outer space to the earth on a mission to save us. And there's this mortal battle, you know, where the hero gets this mortal wound and the hero dies. But wait, it's not over. See, Jesus is the hero of every fairy tale. And Jesus happened. Jesus is real. Jesus is the Prince Charming who awakens us from the sleep of death. Jesus is the beauty who overcomes the beast in our souls. Jesus is the hero beyond all of the heroes of all of our stories. That's the first reason. Second reason to have Jesus as your hero is one of the best ways for you to be a hero is for Jesus to be your hero. You see, that people who have Jesus as their hero do unthinkable things to serve other people. For example, how did we get hospitals? You know, we got hospitals. Jesus one day said, I was sick and you visited me. And so his followers started taking their neighbors who were ill into their homes. And after a while, their homes were full. So they built these freestanding buildings called hospitals. What about the idea that all people should be able to read, universal literacy? You know how that came from? It's because Jesus said, go into all the world and teach people to observe all I commanded you. And so his followers went out and learned languages and they created alphabets where there were no alphabets. So that today, even little tiny villages and tribes in the middle of the Andes can read and write in their own language. The idea of charity, Red Cross, Salvation Army, United Way, all of these charities, how did they begin? They began because Jesus told a story about a good Samaritan who stopped by a road one day. Think about every movement over the last 2,000 years about the dignity of human beings, the abolition of slavery, human rights movement, civil rights movement, the elevation of women. When Aretha sings R-E-S-P-E-C-T, she's just saying what Jesus taught the world about respect for women. And all of these began with people who had Jesus as their hero. And then I want to give you the third reason, that's more than any other reason, and that is that Jesus Christ wants you to take him as your hero today. He wants to be in your life as your Lord and your hero. Heard about a woman who was a pretty good singer who had a hero who was this internationally acclaimed singer. And this woman modeled herself in every way on this woman who was this internationally acclaimed singer. Wanted to sing like her, tried to sing the same songs she did, tried to learn to sing in the way she sang the songs. And every time this internationally known famous singer would come to her city, she would go to the concerts and she would study her inflections and just adored being in the presence of this magnificent singer. And sometimes the singer after the concerts would sign autographs and she'd be down there clustered around her with all the others who were having autographs signed. But this woman never actually went up and met this woman who was her hero. And finally, somebody said to her, why don't you just walk up to her and just say, hey, I'm your biggest fan, and I'm a singer too. And the woman said this. She said, that is my greatest terror. I am deathly afraid that if I go up and meet her and I say that, she's going to say to me, oh, you're a singer. Well, let me listen to you. Sing a little for me. And so she never met her. In her whole life, she just stood there in the general presence of her without meeting her. Think for a moment, some of you here have been coming to church for your whole life. Jesus, somebody, you may think he hung the moon. Jesus may be your hero. Jesus may be somebody you even get in arguments about with people who don't believe in him. But this morning, I want to ask you, have you met him? Is he a part of your life each and every day? Or are you hanging back? There are heroes that want to keep you at arm's length. A lot of heroes out there say, hey, I don't want you too close because if you get too close, I'm not going to look that heroic. So they hide behind privacy glass. Jesus is the exact opposite. Jesus is a hero for whom the people who knew him best loved him most. Recently, I had this kind of blazing insight into the obvious. Just think about this. Jesus' own brother believed he was the Son of God. Think about that for a minute. How impressed are your siblings with you? I mean, it's kind of hard to fool somebody you share a bathroom with, right? And my siblings, I have a hard time getting them to return my phone calls. But according to Josephus in AD 62, James, Jesus' brother, went to his death by stoning rather than deny that his brother was the Son of God. What does that tell you about what it's like to get close to Jesus? The closer you get, the more you adore him and admire him. And that approachable Jesus of the Gospels today is approaching each one of us. And he says, I want to be in your life. He's not out to impress us. He's out to indwell us. Moment by moment, day by day, 24/7, as near as you're breathing. I've always loved Popeye cartoons, kind of a simplistic guy. But I love the way Popeye pops open that can of spinach with those massive forearms. The spinach flies up in the air, goes down his throat. He goes over and beats up on Bluto, rescues Olive Oyl. And how do the cartoons most often end? There stands a Popeye holding Olive Oyl in his arms, and Olive Oyl looks up into his face and says, what? My hero. That's all that Jesus wants from us. Our total surrender and trust. As one of the great Olive Oyls in the arms of Jesus, Mother Teresa once said, I belong to Jesus. If you cut me up into 1,000 pieces, every one of those pieces will belong to Jesus. He can use me without even consulting me. I am his. And today, this Jesus asks you, who do you say that I am? And I hope you'll say, my hero. And even more, I hope you'll say, my Lord and my God.